Hello, everyone. My name is Anubhav Gupta. I'm the Associate Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. We're recording this on Thursday, April 16th, and I hope you're all safe and healthy from wherever you're watching. Since March, here at the Asia Society, we've been presenting online programs every week to analyze the full scope of the ramifications of COVID-19. This is the 9th in the Asia Society Policy Institute's web-only event series entitled Coronavirus, Asia and the World. We have additional events coming up in this series, including two really great conversations next week. The first is with the President of Iraq on Monday, April 20th. And then we have the Indian ambassador to the United States next Tuesday, April 21st, speaking about India's response to the coronavirus. So please join us for those programs as well. As a note to our live audience, if you have any questions for our guests today, please comment on YouTube or Facebook, and we will get to as many of those during our conversation as we can. Today's discussion will be on the impact of COVID-19 on South Asia. And we have a couple of really great guests to walk us through what's happening in the region from Dhaka to Kabul. South Asia has thus far avoided the tragic public health emergencies we've seen in other parts of the world, whether that be in China, which borders multiple South Asian countries, or the United States. As of this morning, according to data collected by Johns Hopkins, confirmed infections have topped 2 million globally, and the number of fatalities stands at over 138,000, which is just staggering. Thankfully, the number of confirmed cases and fatalities in South Asia have been relatively few so far. As of today, here's the status across the region. In India, we have 12,456 confirmed cases and 423 fatalities. Pakistan has 6,505 confirmed cases and 124 fatalities. Bangladesh has 1,572 cases and 60 fatalities. Afghanistan has 840 cases and 30 fatalities. Sri Lanka has 238 cases and 7 fatalities. And then Nepal, Bhutan, and the Maldives all have less than 50 cases and so far, thankfully, 0 fatalities. So despite having nearly 25% of the global population, South Asia at the moment only accounts for 1% of the world's confirmed infections and less than half of 1% of global fatalities. But that does not mean that the region isn't vulnerable. In fact, the high levels of poverty, the gaps in healthcare infrastructure, and the high population densities in many South Asian countries make the region especially susceptible for a major outbreak once the virus begins community transmission. And there's plenty of reason to believe that the number of actual cases is far higher than the confirmed amount because testing has not been extensive. For this reason, multiple countries, especially those that have the most cases, have implemented mandatory lockdowns to flatten the curve and passed stimulus and relief measures to prevent a complete economic crash. To talk to us about how real the threat is, what the government's challenges and responses have been, and what the larger implications are, we have two guests with us today, Ravi Agrawal and Mehmal Sarfraz. Ravi is the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine, where he also writes a weekly briefing on South Asia, which I highly recommend to all of you. Before Foreign Policy, Ravi was at CNN for more than a decade, including as the network's New Delhi bureau chief. He's the author of India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy. Mehmal Sarfraz is the Pakistan correspondent of the Hindu newspaper and is co-founder of The Current, a digital news and lifestyle platform. Mehmal has previously worked as a senior content producer at Neo TV and as the op-ed editor of Daily Times. She's the regional joint general secretary of South Asian Women in Media, a network of women media professionals. And both of our speakers are also alums of our Asia 21 Young Leaders Network, and therefore are a part of the wider Asia Society family. Ravi, Mehmal, thank you for joining us today. I hope you're both healthy and well. Ravi, I'd like to start with you on India. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Modi extended what was already the largest national lockdown in the world by another 20 days. So India will now be under lockdown for a total of 41 days, starting in March 24th and ending on May 3rd. That is unprecedented and suggests that India is at least taking this very seriously. That said, on Tuesday, India surpassed 10,000 cases, confirmed cases, and even though Pakistan had the most cases early on, now India has taken a lead in the number of cases in the region. So let me ask you this. Were you surprised by the extension to the lockdown? And how would you describe the effectiveness of the government's response so far?
I was not surprised by the extension of the lockdown. I should say first, by the way, thank you for having me on. Thank you for organizing this. The Asia Society always hosts such great events, and it's such an honor to be a part of it. But coming back to India, the extension was not that much of a surprise because India still hasn't ramped up testing enough, and the number of cases continue to rise. They are not rising as quickly as they were, say, 2 or 3 weeks ago, but they're still doubling about every 6 days or so, which implies that there's still a lot more to come. And as you noted, the rates of testing are still very low across the country, although they differ between states. Now, all of that said, in terms of the larger response, I would say the answer is almost twofold in that, on the one hand, India, which had its first case in January, was quite quick among sort of, if you compare it to other countries, to shut down its borders, to stop travel, especially air travel, to impose screening at ports and at airports. It did put in measures to try to begin contact tracing among the people who had been tested positive to see who else they had been in touch with. So it's not like the Indian state did not put in place some measures at the start. The problem is, as we're seeing with this virus, is that once community spread begins, and the evidence points to the fact that it has begun in India, it's very hard to trace, it's very hard to keep track of, and ultimately what you really need is mass testing, and that is where India has not really succeeded. It hasn't been able to ramp up the number of tests, the testing points, the speed with which tests are processed, not only for people who may have the coronavirus, but also to test whether people who have died because of COVID-19. So on two fronts there, the testing has not been strong enough. And then lastly, Anubhav, on the lockdown, it was necessary. It was important. And in many respects, the lockdown may have saved tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. That said, it wasn't a perfect lockdown. The lockdown ignored many millions of people who are migrants. There are 45 million migrant workers in India who weren't able to get home in town. It also didn't account for supply chains of food as well as it should have. It didn't account for people who lived in cramped slums for whom social distancing is a privilege. So there are many instances, daily wage laborers for whom guarantees of income were not put in place. There are reasons now why we're beginning to believe that India may have to shift its strategy and bring certain sectors back faster than, say, Western economies would.
Great. And you mentioned the implementation of the lockdown, and Prime Minister Modi did something quite rare, which is he apologized publicly for the initial implementation. You mentioned the hardship that was placed on India's poor and especially migrant workers. Since the initial implementation, now that the lockdown has been extended, what has the government done to make it a little bit easier on migrant workers and for India's poorest?
Sure. Well, it's set up, for example, sort of rest houses for migrant workers wherever they are, as they were on route back to their homes. It has set up camps. It is trying to feed them. Again, it is not like the government isn't trying. It's not like it isn't doing anything at all. This is a vast country that is, as we all know, densely populated, very hard to keep track of all of these people. But enough people have slipped through the cracks, enough people are suffering. We've all seen the images, for example, of in Delhi by the Yamuna River, people just sort of seeking shelter under the bridge. We've all seen the images of thousands and thousands of migrant workers just walking home from Delhi and Mumbai to their villages, even if they are hundreds of kilometers away. Those are heartbreaking scenes. And I guess more than just the nature of what we're seeing is also the danger that these migrant workers could easily be carriers. They could be asymptomatic carriers who would then take coronavirus back to their villages. And, as with all things in India, once this crisis truly reaches rural parts of the country, it'll be that much harder for India to fight back. We all know that the healthcare system is weak nationally, but at least the cities have a higher count of hospital beds and doctors. The villages do not. So that is definitely a scenario that India wants to avoid. The question is, can it really over the next 6 to 9 months, assuming that we don't have a vaccine until then?
Yeah, it's really a lose-lose situation. You either act quickly and deliberately early on to prevent the spread to become really outrageous, but then really endure a lot of short-term challenges. And one of that is, of course, the economic fallout. So I wanted to ask on the economic challenge, which is really imposed by the lockdown itself. So it's in some ways it's a policy-created economic crash or collapse. Is India's stimulus package enough to deal with the economic damage caused by the lockdown so far? I know the initial package was fairly modest. It was only about 1% of GDP. If you compare that to what other countries have done, for instance, in the US, the stimulus was close to 10%. So has India done enough? And what does the government have in the works to continue to try to minimize the economic damage caused by this?
I don't think the stimulus package was large enough. And the truth is, we won't know what people's needs are for quite a while. Much of the Indian economy functions in an informal sort of way where all wages aren't always documented. For a lot of daily wage laborers, they may not have the means to accept government stimulus plans. They may not have the means to accept food rations. They may not have bank accounts to be able to even get their employers to pay them their monthly salaries or their weekly wages. So there are a lot of things that don't always show up as economic activity on the government's books. And I think those are the people who are going to suffer the absolute most. I think states will need to take measures basically to put in place measures to feed people en masse, to ensure that health clinics and the facilities, basic sort of educational facilities and testing reaches people in rural parts of India. It's still unclear whether the state has been able to do any of those things amid the lockdown. So I'm quite worried right now about the impacts of the coronavirus in India. And I think we will see countries across South Asia at this moment, strongly deliberate whether the cure is worse than the disease in this case, in that their considerations are going to be very different from those of Western economies, because it's that much harder to stimulate. It's that much harder to reach people to help them in the first place.
Great. And, these are incredibly tense times. Even in the US, there's been stories about people who've left New York facing discrimination in states nearby. And so, it's not something that's unique to India, but I've heard, there was an unfortunate incident where a Muslim missionary group, the Tablighi Jamaat, held a large gathering that was in Delhi in mid-March. And that has unfortunately led to a lot of cases spreading in India. That much has been reported on. What has happened in the aftermath is quite troubling. There seems to be an increase in anti-Muslim rhetoric and conspiracy theories, especially on social media, that have now actually led to some incidents of actual violence against Muslims. So what do you make of that? And especially given where we were at, just at the end of February, we saw terrible communal violence in Delhi, in the capital, as President Trump was visiting. So given the context we were in, where things were already tense, do you see that coronavirus, this crisis, has made things much worse for India's kind of social fabric?
I do, unfortunately. I think India was already at a very weak point when it comes to social cohesion and communal harmony. And, what the coronavirus has done across the board is to catalyze and exacerbate problems that already existed. So if you look at India's problems with Islamophobia and communal disharmony, those have certainly gotten much worse because of the pandemic. The group you mentioned, Tablighi Jamaat, held a large gathering in Delhi's Nizamuddin West, right next to where I used to live when I lived there. And that gathering has turned out to be sort of the root source of a substantial number of cases across the country as pilgrims left Delhi and then went back to their homes around the country. That said, Muslims were not the only people who were meeting around about that time, and this is the early to middle March. There were other groups that also held meetings, Hindu groups, Sikh groups as well. And it's striking how the Muslim group was singled out for its meeting. Corona Jihad, for example, was a hashtag that was trending on Twitter. A lot of conspiracy theories related to Muslims, such as the theory that Muslims would spit on people to try and spread the virus. I mean, really vile theories that with fake videos and fake imagery were spread online. And you have to say, I mean, this can only happen in a society where there is already a great amount of fear and distrust. And so that really is an indictment, I think, of social cohesion in India. But what we will see, however, is as the number of cases rise rapidly, and they will, it's going to be that much harder to blame one community when this is clearly spreading much more rapidly and by many more people across the country.
Okay. And the government, really has a responsibility to some extent in making sure that there's solidarity, that there's a unified response. How would you say that the federal government has dealt with this kind of troubling rise in Islamophobia? When I say the central government.
They don't have a very good track record on that, I'm afraid. In large part, if you look back over the last few years, the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, led by Prime Minister Modi, has many senior ministers, senior politicians within its party who have led the cause for increasing the divide between Hindus and Muslims. You have very senior ministers who have led the dog whistles, as it were, to try and divide these two groups, to create more fear, and essentially divide them into separate vote banks, as it were. So in that sense, the responsibility for the current mood lies with them. But in terms of how this particular crisis has been handled, in terms of the Tablighi Jamaat message and how they've been vilified, it's not just the government, it is also the media, which could have done a much better job of making clear what exactly happened, why the religion isn't to blame. And it's crazy that we even need to be talking about this. But part of the problem in India is that the media itself is so dependent on government support in terms of advertising. And the Indian media is also heavily dependent on advertising, not on subscriptions, which makes them that much more susceptible to government messaging. So that's certainly a problem as well that the entire country is facing.
Thank you, Ravi. So a lot of problematic trend lines in India. Mehmal, I'd like to turn to you. So Pakistan has also just extended its national lockdown for an additional 14 days. Can you give us a status update on the trajectory of the virus in Pakistan and kind of what the latest the government is doing?
Yes, Anubhav, thank you for having me. So I first like to start by saying that, the number of deaths have increased to 128 and the cases have also increased to 6,871 in Pakistan. So the number of cases keep increasing with every passing hour, unfortunately. As for the lockdown, well, we may have extended it for another 2 weeks, but we have relaxed it. So let me just begin by saying that, the problem, let me identify the problem. The first problem is the mixed signal by the government, especially the federal government. What they've basically done is they announced it on Tuesday that, while we're extending the lockdown, what we're doing is that we're opening up some industrial sectors, some low-risk industries, and also shops like dry cleaners and nurseries and vets and other bookstores, stationery stores. So what this has led to is it has given a mixed signal to the people of Pakistan. The first 2 weeks when the original lockdown started was actually in line with, it was effective because it wasn't a curfew, but it was a very effective lockdown because it was in line with the global understanding of the disease that, there should be social distancing. You can only go out when it is necessary. So people were following that and most shops were closed except for grocery shops and hospitals and pharmacies. Most of them were, and offices, most of offices were also closed. I've been working from home since 16th March while the lockdown was implemented on 24th. But Prime Minister Imran Khan, from day one, has not been in favor of lockdown. He first confused lockdown with a curfew, which it isn't. And people and sources within the government also tell me that Prime Minister never wanted a lockdown, but in the end, because the Sindh government, the provincial government, actually one of the 4 provinces, they went for a lockdown, they announced it, and then the other 3 provinces followed suit. And then, Prime Minister also understood that, we have to do it because the healthcare experts and everybody else was saying it. So the first challenge is now this lockdown, this lifting of restrictions on lockdown. So people are now basically thinking that, if the government has lifted the restrictions, then, there's no harm in going out. I've actually seen that, traffic has increased. Shops around my house have opened up, which were closed in the previous 2 weeks. People are not taking it as seriously as they were in the last 2 weeks. And this is something that I actually feel, and not just me, it's a lot of health experts who are saying that, this can lead to an exponential growth in the number of coronavirus cases, because Pakistan's own government had said that their projections were that by April 25th, we'll reach the peak of our cases. But they've actually lifted the lockdown before that. They could have increased it at least for another week. I know that Ramzan is starting on 25th, and Prime Minister Imran Khan was rightly worried about poor people and, poorest of the poor and daily wagers, laborers, and small and medium businesses shutting down. But what the government has essentially done is put them at risk, put the poorest of the poor at more risk. And this can lead to a community spread. Already more than 50% of our cases are now locally transmitted. They began with pilgrims from pilgrims from Iran and pilgrims from Saudi Arabia, and also international travelers. Our first 2 corona cases came out on February 26th. But now most of the cases are locally transmitted. So there's no proper mechanism to actually test or aggressively test, just like Ravi said, he mentioned this about India as well. And this is the same problem in Pakistan, that we're not aggressively testing at all. So we may have contained the spread for the first 2 weeks when we went into a lockdown, and now with the relaxation in the lockdown, I think, God forbid, but I actually feel that, the cases will exponentially go up and we will not know how to deal with it.
So a lot of the similar challenges as we talked about for India. Mehmal, in the US, we've seen several state governors navigating the crisis in a very different way from the federal government, which is, generally been seen as being slow to act. There seems to be the same dynamic in Pakistan. You've written about how the response of some provincial governments has been much more vigorous than the central governments. And there's a lot of variation between at the provincial level as well. So can you give us a sense of that? Which provinces are doing better, which are doing worse? And then overall, how has that disjuncture between the provincial governments and the center affected the overall effectiveness of Pakistan's response?
Okay, so Anubhav, the thing is that, Sindh, so we have 4 provinces, right? Punjab, which is the largest province, then there's Sindh, second largest province, then there's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. Now, Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa are being ruled by Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which is in power at the federal level, Prime Minister Imran Khan's party. So they have a government in Punjab and they have a government in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and the Balochistan government is an ally of the PTI. Sindh is the only province where the Pakistan People's Party, which is not in alliance with the ruling Tehreek-e-Insaf, is in power. And this is former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto's, late Benazir Bhutto's party, now being led by her son Bilawal Bhutto. But the Chief Minister of Sindh is Murad Ali Shah. So what happened was when the corona pandemic started, we saw from day one that the Sindh government was very hands-on. They were in favor of a lockdown. They wanted a lockdown. They asked for a lockdown. And due to the 18th Amendment constitutional change that happened during the PPP government almost a decade ago, so now the provinces are autonomous. They can make their own decisions. They don't really have to rely on the federal government to, tell them what to do. It's not a very centralized system anymore in Pakistan. And so the Sindh government said that we are going for a lockdown. They announced the lockdown, I think it was on 22nd and it was going to start from 23rd March. Prime Minister Imran Khan Prime Minister Imran Khan actually came on TV that day and he addressed the nation and he said something like, lockdown shouldn't happen. This is on the same day then when he knew that, Sindh was going to announce a lockdown, and Sindh had already said that we were going to impose a lockdown. But then what happened? So then what happened was that so the next day, the other three provinces also said that we are going for a lockdown. And this actually happened because a lot of people and a lot of sources say that. And of course, it's on the record as well that DG ISPR, the military spokesperson, also held a press conference. And he said that, the provinces have asked us to come and help them and we're going for a lockdown. So basically, a lot of people say that while Prime Minister Imran Khan himself was against a lockdown, the military, in a way, forced him, because what everybody thought was that Sindh is doing the right thing because that's what the global projections were all about, that, you have to go for a lockdown. And the second step was, of course, aggressive testing. And so that's what Sindh did. Sindh led by example. Now the problem is that the response of the other three provinces has not been bad either, by the way. They have been very good, very vigilant. But Sindh has been praised the most because they've been very focused. They know what they're doing. They are focusing on how to control the spread. The lockdown in Sindh was quite stricter than the other provinces in a way. But what happened was that then, because of the projection that the Sindh government got in the media, also their political opponents like the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's party, they were also praising Sindh government and the efforts by them. The PTI felt insecure in a way. It's a global emergency. It's a national emergency also. This is something that should not have been politicized. But for some reason, a lot of their ministers and a lot of their members started attacking the People's Party government. The People's Party government has always been attacked for its alleged corruption and, not being that great administratively. They're very good at legislation, but a lot of people say that, they're not very good at administration. But this time, the Sindh government proved that they had achieved administrative excellence during this whole corona pandemic. So this is something that maybe made them insecure. And although this is not the time, but even now, the PTI ministers are attacking the Sindh government, which I feel is very unfortunate.
So there's a lot of kind of political, it sounds like it's become a political football between the different parties. It's very similar to what's happening in other parts of the world. So Pakistan at least isn't alone in that. I wanted to ask you, Mehmal, about the economy. So, we had Pakistan's economy was already struggling. We went to the IMF last year for a bailout. You were dealing with currency devaluation, rising inflation. So, suffice to say, COVID-19 did not hit at a good time as far as the economy was concerned. So what's the economic fallout been already? And how is the government trying to really respond to that? How are they preparing themselves for the short term and the medium term?
So, Anubhav, the thing is that even if there was no corona, Pakistan's economy was falling apart, as you've just mentioned. Our debt was already too high. It would have been a very difficult job for the government to come up with a proper budget. We were already melting down. What corona has done is destroyed us. It has fried our economy. This is extremely unfortunate, but even the World Bank report on South Asia, its recent report said that Pakistan will face its first recession in 68 years. Of course, there's going to be a global recession, but Pakistan will be really hard hit. And the economic mismanagement of this government, we've already seen our finance minister being changed early on, and even then, the government being very clueless about economy and the measures that they took. So I don't know how they are going to deal with it now. The economic experts that I've talked to, the businessmen that I've talked to, people in the industry that I've talked to, they're actually saying, that things will get worse, because the thing is that they've given some bailout package to the construction industry. They will not ask the builders where the money is coming from. But what will happen to the small and medium businesses? They will shut down. What will happen to the poorest of the poor? While I understand that the government is trying to help the poorest of the poor. There's, of course, the poverty reduction program called the SAS program, which was formerly the Benazir Income Support Program, which is very successful. And the government is giving money, identifying families through that and giving money to them. But the daily wager, the laborer, all of these people are at high risk now. Even if you've opened up industries and you've given them SOPs, the problem with that is that, so a busload of factory workers will go, there's no public transport, so the industry has to manage their own transport. So a bus will be full of workers going there. They'll pick them and drop them. So what if they get corona in the factory? What if there are no, because most of these industries will not follow SOPs. There won't be anything, any strict action won't be taken against them. So they can be spreaders, not super spreaders maybe, but, minor spreaders. And they can give it to their families. And then, so what will happen then? This is something, a lot of us asked when on Tuesday, the government announced that, they are kind of relaxing the lockdown, while not really saying that they are relaxing it, but they said, it's a partial lockdown. A lot of us asked that if you could have just waited for a week or 10 days, things would have been better because we would have known our peak. We would have hit our curve's peak. And then we would have known how to deal with it. Now, when you've opened up the industry, we saw the religious scholars over here say that, we're going to open up mosques as well then. So then what's stopping people from opening up marriage halls or from having a large public gatherings? So if you're, so you haven't really done it gradually. You really haven't done that gradually. What you've really done is that, you've given people an excuse to flout the law, and you've given people an excuse to actually think that, maybe corona is not that that serious, maybe it's just a flu. Maybe we will not die. So basically, we've kind of, unfortunately, the government has kind of downplayed the seriousness, and I'm talking about the federal government over here. They've kind of downplayed the seriousness of this entire thing because, even the Prime Minister and others have been saying that, it's not janleva. So janleva is something that, you cannot die from it. They said it in the beginning, and then they said only older people die. Even though Pakistan's projections and trajectory actually shows that, more younger people have died than older people. So if I have an underlying condition, I can die if I have corona. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, it sounds, interestingly, like, India and Pakistan have really some of the same problems, and the balance that we talked about a little bit earlier, being really deliberate and acting quickly. India has tended to do that, but a lot of the short-term impacts have fallen on the poor and migrant workers. And some of those concerns about the worst off in Pakistan have led to perhaps not enough strong measures to be taken place. But we're close to we're at the halfway mark. So I want to turn to the rest of South Asia. Mehmal, I'll come to you with some more questions on Pakistan at the end. But let's turn to the rest of the region. So Ravi, we've spent a lot of time on India and Pakistan because they have the most cases. But I would like to cover other countries, especially Bangladesh, which is now the only other nation that has more than 1,000 confirmed cases. So can you give us a sense of what is happening elsewhere in the region?
Sure. So Bangladesh, as you would imagine, is the country with the third largest population in South Asia, 160 odd million. So no surprise it has the third highest number of cases. Bangladesh has essentially almost followed India's lead in terms of when to impose lockdowns, when to extend them. So they've had a similar track record in that case. Although what Bangladesh has done better than India is to signal ahead of time that it is going to extend the lockdown or impose a lockdown. And this has allowed migrant workers in that country to get back to their villages. So in that sense, the Sheikh Hasina government has just planned a little better, communicated a little better than the Indian government has. I think within Bangladesh, one area among many areas of deep concern is the migrant populations, especially the Rohingya population around Cox's Bazar and other areas in Bangladesh. They are living packed in camps that make it so much more likely were one or two people to contract the coronavirus that everyone else would. That is an area of immense concern, and the people there obviously have other comorbidities ranging from lack of just general health care, but also malnutrition, which could make them more susceptible eventually to succumbing to COVID-19. So, Bangladesh is pretty much at the same level of the curve as India and Pakistan are, in that it's the rate of increase in discovery of cases has been similar. What that suggests to me, however, is that much worse is ahead of us in the rest of April, but also in May and June, because they still haven't begun testing enough for us to really see a real exponential rise in the number of cases.
Right. Bangladesh is also particularly vulnerable, its economy, given its reliance on remittances, its kind of export-oriented textile and garments industry, and the fact that it has fairly close trade ties with China, which has obviously been impacted quite a bit as well. So how do you see economically Bangladesh faring, and what has the government done to start to minimize some of the damage?
Well, the biggest impact is going to be on exports right away. So the entire garment industry, which employs hundreds of thousands of people in various forms, is really going to struggle because those factories have shut down for now. Some of it hasn't even been by choice. The likes of Gap and Unimark and Zara have actually canceled large-scale contracts with these factories, in part because they are anticipating a slowdown in demand. They're also struggling to keep up with supply chains in the same way. So they may now look to bring some of their manufacturing units closer to home. If that's the case, then Bangladesh won't just suffer in the near term, but will suffer in the longer term. Bangladesh has put in place some measures, again, a very small amount of GDP, to try and help workers who work in these types of factories. But the real impacts of that won't be faced right away. It's going to be seen a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, when those contracts don't really come back in the same way. And then Bangladesh will have a real longer-term unemployment problem on its hands.
And turning to some of the smaller countries that haven't had as many cases, Sri Lanka has a little over 200 cases, but Nepal, Bhutan, and the Maldives all have under 50 at least confirmed cases so far. Do you think the problem isn't as bad there, or is it, again, the similar trend where we don't have enough testing to really know the extent of the problem?
I think it's pretty much the same across South Asia, in that there isn't a single South Asian country that has a very good track record of high rates of testing, of strong healthcare systems that are very good at contact tracing or very good at isolation, or have high numbers of hospital beds or high ratios of doctors to the population. In that sense, South Asia across the board is in a pretty bad spot. But of the countries you mentioned, one thing that strikes me that unites them is tourism. And so what we will see in the immediate term is that countries like the Maldives, for example, which, about 2/3 of its GDP comes from tourism-related activities, that's going to come to a complete standstill. Tourism is also very important for Sri Lanka, that had already been depressed since the Easter Sunday attack last year, but was just beginning to come back. They had put in place a spate of measures, from visa-free travel to discounts for tour operators. All of those efforts will also have been hit pretty badly. Same with Nepal again. So same with Bhutan as well. So a lot of these countries are going to struggle in the short term. And the question now is, in the longer term, how quickly they're able to bounce back, both in terms of their national economies, but also what they're doing for the many millions of people across those countries who depend on those sectors and are going to need some form of financial and economic support from their governments. The question is, as always in South Asia, how do you get to people? How do you help them? How do you help people who are unbanked? How do you help people who may not have access to the internet or other means of being able to even get out the message of how much they are struggling?
Great, thank you for that. I'd like to turn to some more kind of region-wide issues that have region-wide implications. And one of those, one of the things that's been happening over the past year that really will have a lot of impact on the rest of the region, stability in the region, is the peace process and the negotiations ongoing in Afghanistan. So has this impacted those talks at all, Ravi? I know that last week the government of Afghanistan freed 100 Taliban prisoners as a gesture. Do you foresee that negotiations will continue in a positive direction?
Well, on the one hand, you have Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. Special Envoy, who was there earlier this week in Doha and speaking to the co-founder of the Taliban. So on the one hand, those talks are continuing in terms of trying to put in place assurances and to negotiate the pace at which Taliban prisoners are released, but also the scale at which they are released. I think the larger issue amid all of this is that Afghanistan is going to have a real breakdown in terms of how it's coordinating aid, in terms of how the pandemic is going to impact its populations. In any society where there is a lack of trust, where the government isn't united, where you have the government not even controlling all of the territory of the land, those situations are just ripe for further exacerbation by any disease. And so in that sense, this pandemic could hit Afghanistan most of all. Remember, we already have a situation, at least in Kabul, where you have an elected government that it was a disputed election, as it was the last time round. And they were hoping to conduct fresh elections, but that wasn't able to happen because of the winter in Afghanistan, which, as you know, is deep and cold and makes it that much harder for people to vote. So on many counts, Afghanistan is ill-served by its elected government. It is ill-served by the fact that the Taliban controls as much territory as it does, and may not be cooperating with healthcare authorities as an elected government would. So, irrespective of what kinds of deals are struck between the US and the Taliban, I think what that will mostly impact is the timeline for the withdrawal of US troops. It doesn't say much for how the state is going to handle what is going to be a flat-out health crisis on its hands.
Mehmal, I'd like to talk to you about another conflict in the region, and that's the kind of ongoing rivalry between India and Pakistan. You would think that in the midst of a global pandemic, during which both countries have really a shared set of challenges ahead of them, and they've had to institute unprecedented shutdowns, that they would try to cooperate and get along. Yet, you look at Kashmir along the line of control, we've now seen a major uptick in border clashes between the two militaries. So what in the world is going on there?
Well, the problem is that, the Modi government, I find that, the Modi government is the main problem at the moment. And I'm not saying this just because I'm a Pakistani, so I'm being very nationalistic or something, but no, actually our government, Pakistan's government and also Pakistan's military has been asking for peace with India for many years now. But I think the Modi government, maybe it's the policy, it's the domestic policy, or maybe it's also a part of their foreign policy, that they do not want any talks with Pakistan. They do not want Pakistan and peace between India and Pakistan. Just last year, we were on the brink of a war just before the Indian elections. I think that this plays into, the jingoism plays into BJP's voters. You saw that, the war actually made Modi win with such a high margin. That's what a lot of Indian analysts also said, Indian journalists, and, they all said that, the war helped Modi win the elections with such a high margin. So I think that it's because of Mr. Modi, and I'm not whitewashing the flaws in our policy and, the mistakes that we made, also including cross-border terrorism and other things. But I think the recent actions of the Modi government are a testament to the fact that they're not really interested in peace with India and Pakistan, between India and Pakistan. I'll just give you an example. So you see, Pakistan is still giving visas to Indians, journalists or other people as well. But India stopped giving visas to Pakistanis a long time ago, except for business visas and I think medical visas. So sure. I think, this happened around 2016, 2017. People like me who've been to India like countless times, we couldn't get a visa because the Indian embassy said that, it's not in our hands anymore. It's just from Delhi, the visa instructions from Delhi. So this is a problem. So then the second thing is that post August 5th, what happened in Kashmir, I really don't think that, there's a way forward. And I don't think that the Modi government wants a way forward in any case, because they're not going to budge from their position on Kashmir. Then we've seen what's going on with the minorities in India. So I do feel that, the Modi government, and even though Pakistan's government has been saying, even during the entire Pulwama thing, we kept saying that, we want peace. We don't want a war. Let's not go for a war. So this is something that, I feel that it's maybe because of their domestic audience or something to do with BJP's Hindutva policy.
But so I think it was clear that relations were, at a low point after August last year. But I want to focus kind of on what's been happening since COVID hit. So you've had, a greater number of border clashes. And Ravi, I don't know if you might want to chime in on this. India has alleged that infiltrations across the line of control has gone up. Is there any truth to that? Or is that, I know both sides have disagreed on that. Is there any independent way to verify any of this?
I don't think so. I don't have good sources or data on which of the two sides are right, but it's enough to say that they disagree with each other. I mean, there was cross-border shelling over the weekend as well, and of course, both sides disagreed on who initiated it. Both sides disagreed on the number of wounded on either side. Pakistan summoned the top Indian envoy in Islamabad. India tried to do the same. It's much of a muchness, really. I think, as Mehmal was saying, however, it's becoming clear that it may be in India's interest to preserve this status quo. I think Pakistan is a handy enemy for India to have. It sort of, in a strange way, unites the Indian population against this sort of country that is seen as an aggressor or seen as responsible for attacks on Indian soil, some of which is actually true. There is a history of militants from Pakistan coming across the border. So some of that anger and resentment actually has a foundation in Pakistani state policy. But all of that said, as it stands right now, I think the Modi government has understood that it doesn't even have that much to gain from a peace dialogue with Pakistan. It has found that it could unilaterally make the moves it made in Pakistan, which were widely seen by its base in India as the smart thing to do. It has seen that there is a great appeal across India and in the media for its sort of wider anti-Pakistan stance. And within that, that fits into the larger kind of pro-Hindu movement across India and the marginalization of its Muslim population. So I don't really see much changing as long as India doesn't want it to change.
And you would think, that all of that makes a lot of sense. You definitely have seen, a freeze on the Indian side and any sort of willingness to negotiate. But you would think something like this would provide some sort of opening or incentive for these governments to cooperate, especially given that, Prime Minister Modi called for a summit of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which was a regional forum that India had not really been working with quite a bit in the recent past. And so there was a summit initiated by India. India called for a COVID-19 emergency fund and called for regional cooperation. But it sounds like, if India-Pakistan tensions are continuing, is there really a chance for tangible, impactful regional cooperation? Or do you think India-Pakistan tensions will continue to undermine that?
I think they will continue to undermine that. And I think the move to sort of coalesce regional leaders had less to do with tangible cooperation and more to do with sort of the symbolism of Prime Minister Modi as this wider sort of global leader. He also made calls to other world leaders and publicized them on his Twitter account. So I think that was part of a larger effort to be seen as statesmanlike and to be seen as a strong leader of global standing. In terms of the actual funds that were raised regionally, it was a very small amount, which is not really going to substantively change anything for a single one of the countries involved. And I think as each nation is realizing, they're also in it for themselves in this moment. I think every country is going to face its own crisis of varying degrees of severity. And what they're going to have to focus on is just on procuring enough ventilators, enough masks, enough testing kits. So China, for example, is sending some 600,000 immediate testing kits to India. I think they're due to arrive in the next day or so. I think that's what India's diplomatic focus is going to be on in the coming weeks and months, not really on smaller sort of inter-regional cooperation. And then the other thing I will say is that what will lead the way in terms of anything that has to do with the region is trade. And those things are going to be very difficult in the next few months because of the pandemic. So that's another thing to watch out for, how supply chains are going to be disrupted.
Sure. I have a question from YouTube, Mehmal, for you. And the question is, with Pakistan hosting one of China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative projects in CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and the fact that, all of this kind of began in Wuhan, how has this impacted Pakistan-China relations? Has it created any doubts in Pakistan about CPEC? And, especially, and I'll add a question to that, especially because Pakistan has needed so much international aid, tell us a little bit about how much China has given or been there for that. Has the dependency actually increased in the last month or so?
So the thing is, of course, because of Corona, we needed Chinese expertise, and Chinese experts helped us a lot. They've visited Pakistan in recent days also, and from day one, they were helping the Punjab government. I talked to the Punjab government spokesperson about the Corona outbreak, and she said that the Chinese, we were talking to Chinese experts through video conferencing. We were actually doing what they were telling us to do. We were planning the lockdown, the testing, everything else as per their experience and their expertise. So China has really helped us with this. The thing is that I don't think that CPEC or this initiative would actually get affected in a way, because, we didn't get any Corona cases from China, by the way, despite the border being all open, despite the flights being open at that time when Corona virus had hit Pakistan. So there weren't any cases from China. And our students who were in Wuhan, we were one of the few countries that did not bring back our students from Wuhan, because we followed the Chinese guidelines. And we also realized that, we won't be able to deal with them or give them the health benefits that the Chinese government is going to give them. So we did not evacuate our students and our nationals from Wuhan at that time. Although I would say that, because there's going to be a global recession, and as everybody has pointed out, that, South Asia is going to be hit really bad because of it. So I really don't think that, trade between China and Pakistan will reopen, apart from masks and ventilators and other things that, we need for Corona, of course. But building of infrastructure, even though we have opened up the construction industry, but that's just to give something to our workers. So that's just one part of it. But I'm not really sure that, how fast the CPEC project will go on now, given at least for the next year. I think it'll slow down a bit. But the relationship between China and Pakistan, as always, has been, very good. And we've been on the best of terms, especially during this whole Corona thing as well.
And it's quite the contrast, right? You have China and Pakistan have one of the strongest kind of partnerships for both countries, whereas India and China have an ongoing rivalry. Ravi, do you see, so far, how is this pandemic, do you think, impacting Sino-Indian relations, if at all?
Well, I mean, if it turns out that China indeed is delivering all of these testing kits to India, I think then that's going to be something that will only strengthen the India-Chinese partnership, as it were. I don't really see India as a great rival to China, however. I think India may want to see itself that way, but there really is a real gulf between the two countries. Average incomes in China, for example, are 4x what they are in India. So in that sense, India has a lot of catching up to do. And, what we cannot ignore is that India was already slowing down. Its economy was already in trouble over the last 18 months or so. And this crisis is going to hurt India in untold ways. I think China's economy is much more prepared for this and will bounce back much quicker than other economies in Asia, in part because of the strength of the healthcare system there and their ability to test rapidly and to move on from this crisis, as it were. They also have a stronger domestic economy to be able to sort of sustain demand and supply. India, on the other hand, I think will struggle a lot more, will need to lean on China for a lot of medical health and resources in the coming months if China is willing to do so. So I think the larger sort of economic outlook at large for South Asian countries is quite worrisome over the coming months, and most of all because we don't even know how deep the pain will be, given how many hundreds of millions of workers across the region are simply unaccounted for. Migrant workers, informal laborers, daily wage laborers, people who don't register always formally in the books. I think this is a question policymakers will have to address more and more in the coming weeks and months, which is how to bring certain sectors back in ways in which allow workers to be able to put food on the table.
Great. Well, we're close to the 1 hour mark, so I want to start bringing the conversation to a close. You both shared, highlighted some of the really incredibly serious challenges ahead for individual governments and for the region and its people as a whole. But I would like to, if you'll allow me, end on a more hopeful note. As you've tracked and reported on the region, have you run into any particular stories that have raised your spirits? Anything that's given you a sliver of a silver lining? Mehmal, maybe I'll turn to you first. If there's something you could share?
No, I think Ravi had something, so I'd like him to share first. Because
Well, this is a small ray of light, but I've been heartened to hear stories about how communities are coming together, donating food. There are gurudwaras and temples that have been leaving out food for the poor and the homeless and the hungry. There are small Rotary groups and inner wheel groups across the region that have been coalescing, that have been donating money to national funds, but also to individual villages and places that they already had strong networks of giving to. So it's been quite heartening to see those communities ramp up their giving and ensure that at the very least food is being distributed more than it would have been if it were purely a state-driven response. I think in places across South Asia where the state isn't that strong, where public healthcare and infrastructure aren't that strong, there are actually wider networks than we know of and imagine of smaller aid groups that are driven by, the largesse of families and just communities. Those stories, I think, have been quite heartening to follow in the last few weeks, and I think they will be a big part of the response in the coming months.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Ravi. And honestly, guys, we could keep talking about this for quite some time. It's a large region. It's a very important part of the world, but we want to let our audience off the hook after an hour. So I'll bring the discussion to a close. I'm really grateful to both of you for sharing your insights into what's happening in the region and how governments are responding. Thank you for joining me. And I'd also like to thank all of our viewers who are watching and who sent questions online for Ask these additional coronavirus programming and analysis, and for information about upcoming events in the series. I mentioned 2 next week with the Iraqi president, as well as the Indian ambassador to the United States. Please like us on Facebook, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Asia Policy. This has been a pleasure for me. Wherever you are, whether it's in Mumbai, Karachi, Colombo, New York, please stay safe and remember that we're all in this together. This is Anubhav Gupta for the Asia Society Policy Institute. Take care.